Good morning. I call the meeting of the Capital Investment Committee today, Thursday, January 23rd, to order. And may I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Madam Chair, I so move the motion, the minutes of
Last week.
whatever date that was,
Okay, great.
January 16th.
All right, thank you. Do we have any discussion? All right, hearing none. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Well, there you have it. The motion prevails and the minutes are approved, and there is a quorum present. Members and public, today we have a very exciting day in the Capital Investment Committee. We are going to hear all about the B3 Sustainable Building Standards, and I have several testifiers. And first on the list, we have the Minnesota Legislative Auditor's Office. Thank you so much for being here. We have presenting Ms. Caitlin Badger and Jody Rodriguez. Go ahead. And you can introduce yourself for the record. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good morning. For the record, my name is Jody Munson Rodriguez, and I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Program Evaluation Division. I want to thank the members for having us here today to talk about our evaluation of sustainable building guidelines. As you may know, state law requires all new buildings and major renovations that receive general obligation bond proceeds to follow the state's sustainable building guidelines. The guidelines address various sustainability elements such as air quality, lighting, and energy efficiency standards. However, we found that there's little oversight of this program. There's no state agency that ensures all building projects comply with the guidelines, and there are no consequences if building projects do not comply with the guidelines. We made recommendations to the legislature when we issued this report, and those recommendations do still stand. If the legislature wants to continue requiring that certain buildings comply with the sustainable building guidelines, the legislature should clarify the law, identify which agency is in charge of this program, and take proactive steps to ensure that building projects subject to the guidelines are held accountable. To get more into the details of this evaluation, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Caitlin Badger, who is the manager for this evaluation. Thank you.
Ms. Badger.
Thank you, Chair Franson, members. Thanks again for having us here today. For the record, my name is Caitlin Badger. I'm with the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and I was the manager for this evaluation. Before we begin, I'd also like to thank my colleagues who assisted with this report, Will Harrison and Kyle Malone. And I'd also like to thank the Departments of Administration and Commerce, as well as the Center for Sustainable Building Research for their assistance with our evaluation. So I'll start today by providing a quick roadmap of my comments. I'll first highlight the key findings I'm going to discuss before I provide a brief program overview. I'll then dig into our findings and recommendations in greater detail, first regarding program roles and responsibilities before discussing the extent to which projects have complied with the guidelines. I'll then touch briefly on program goals before wrapping up with a discussion about the outcomes of the sustainable building guidelines. I'll also note that throughout this presentation, we've included a number of pictures in our slides of various buildings that were subject to the Sustainable Building Guidelines, so you can get a bit of a flavor for what types of projects are subject to the guidelines. So first, our key findings. We found that there was a lack of clarity pertaining to the roles and responsibilities of the various entities involved with the Sustainable Building Guidelines, and that lack of clarity has led to a program with limited oversight and accountability. Further, we found the extent to which projects have complied with the guidelines is unknown, and that the program lacks clear goals and objectives. Finally, we found that the outcomes of the Sustainable Building Guidelines are also unknown, both with regard to how the guidelines have affected project cost as well as the building overall sustainability. So I'll start by briefly reviewing what are the Sustainable Building Guidelines. According to the Sustainable Building Guidelines, the guidelines aim to reduce energy consumption, enhance the health and well-being of building occupants, and improve the quality of the environment. By law, the Sustainable Building Guidelines are required for certain capital construction projects. Specifically, state law requires that all new buildings and all major renovations that are fully or partially funded with general obligation bond proceeds follow the guidelines. This includes buildings run and overseen by state governments, state agencies, as well as those overseen by local governments. In addition, in accordance with state statutes, the guidelines must include several sustainability elements. For example, the guidelines must incorporate certain energy efficiency standards established in law that are referred to as Sustainable Building 2030. Additionally, the guidelines must facilitate productivity improvements and create and maintain a healthy environment, among other various requirements. As you can see here, the current sustainable building guidelines are organized into 5 different categories of sustainability, such as energy and atmosphere and indoor environmental quality. You can find additional information about these various categories in Exhibit 1.1 of our report on page 5. Each of these categories includes several different guidelines with numerous requirements. So for example, on this slide, we've included the energy and atmosphere category. That category includes several different guidelines pertaining to energy efficiency, renewable energy, et cetera. Most of these guidelines have multiple requirements. And so for example, you can see here the guideline E.4, which is about atmospheric protection, has multiple requirements, 2 specifically that pertain to reducing refrigerant leakage and just pertaining to general overall acceptable refrigerants. Overall, projects adhering to the sustainable building guidelines may need to meet up to 90 different individual requirements, depending on the scope of the actual construction project. So you may be wondering who is involved in developing, implementing, and overseeing these guidelines. By law, there are 2 key state agencies involved with the guidelines. Statutes require the Departments of Administration and Commerce to develop the sustainable building guidelines with assistance from other agencies. Statutes also require Admin and Commerce to periodically review and revise the guidelines. In practice, the Department of Administration's purview has been the sustainable building guidelines overall, whereas the Department of Commerce has focused more on the Sustainable Buildings 2030, which is that energy use and carbon reduction component of the guidelines. In addition to Admin and Commerce, there are 2 other groups that are sort of key players with regard to the sustainable building guidelines. I mentioned on that last slide that statutes assign responsibility for developing the guidelines to Admin and Commerce. However, the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota, rather than a state agency, has assumed primary responsibility for administering the sustainable building guidelines. Both Admin and Commerce contract with the center for a variety of services, including updating and managing the guidelines, providing education and technical assistance to the various people working on the construction projects, and a number of additional tasks and responsibilities. The third group of people with a significant role in the sustainable building guidelines is the project team. So overall, project team members are these various individuals who are responsible for the aspects of design, construction, and operations of a particular construction or renovation project. So project team members such as agency contacts or guideline leaders and many more play this integral role in implementing the guidelines on a project-by-project basis. Project teams include numerous different individuals, some from the public sector, such as agency or local government staff, as well as people working in the private sector, such as architects, energy modelers, and others. These individuals coordinate the completion of guideline requirements on these specific construction projects. They provide information about the project's efforts to follow the guidelines and a number of additional tasks. So with that to set the stage, I'd like to dive into the first key issue that we found, which is there's a lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities for this program. We found that there was widespread disagreement and confusion about the roles and responsibilities regarding the guidelines. Today, I'll talk about two levels, if you will, where we found a lack of clarity about program roles. So first, there's a lack of clarity at this programmatic level regarding expectations for how the program should be administered and overseen. Second, there's a lack of clarity amongst project team members about the sustainable building guidelines at this individual project level. So first, let's take a look at the lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities at the programmatic level. I mentioned earlier that statutes require the Departments of Administration and Commerce to develop the sustainable building guidelines. Although statutes identify these agencies as being responsible for developing the guidelines, statutes don't assign any agency responsibility for administering and overseeing the guidelines after they've been developed. So for example, statutes don't task a specific agency with identifying projects that are subject to the guidelines, or with monitoring and enforcing compliance with the guidelines, or evaluating the outcomes of the guidelines overall. We also found there's a lack of clarity at the project level with regard to the roles and responsibilities for project team members. So I'll remind you, these are the people working on a project-by-project basis to implement the guidelines. Statutes don't define the roles of those project team members in implementing the guidelines. They don't, for instance, describe what role agency or local government staff play in ensuring that these projects comply with the guidelines. And the guidelines also do not define the roles and responsibilities of these various team members. So many project team members that we interviewed ultimately told us that their expectations were not clear in terms of how to fulfill their roles with regard to the guidelines. And many project team members said they didn't receive adequate training on, again, how to fulfill those roles. The disagreement about roles and responsibilities regarding the guidelines has ultimately led to a program that lacks accountability and oversight. So for instance, we found that sometimes agency staff and project team members assumed that other entities were taking important actions regarding the guidelines that they weren't actually taking, which then led us to question whether or not those important actions are happening at all. We provide a number of different examples of that happening in the report, but I want to highlight a key one here. So one of the key questions we were asked to look at as part of this evaluation was to figure out who is responsible for enforcing the sustainable building guidelines. As you can see on this slide, we surveyed project team members who had worked on recent projects subject to the guidelines and asked them who, in their opinion, was responsible for ensuring that projects comply with the guidelines. The responses we received from project team members varied widely, as you can see here on this slide. Nearly a quarter of the people who responded to our survey didn't know who was responsible for ensuring that projects complied with the guidelines. And then the remaining responses really varied widely from various project team members being responsible, such as the owner or the guideline leader, to the Center for Sustainable Building Research, to the Department of Administration, and others. So based on our conversations with agency staff and project team members, as well as this survey, it's unclear who, if anyone, is actually ensuring that projects comply with the guidelines. We think that this lack of clarity in law with regard to the roles and responsibilities is really a critical issue, both with regard to which entity is supposed to be administering and overseeing the guidelines and what specifically the legislature expects that entity to do. So for example, does the legislature expect that an agency track whether projects are complying with the guidelines? If projects aren't complying with the guidelines, does the legislature expect an agency then to take action to try and bring that project into compliance? So we recommend that the legislature first determine which agency should be responsible for the overall administration and oversight of the guidelines, and then codify in law what specifically that agency's responsibilities are. Once the legislature determines which agency should be responsible for administering and overseeing the guidelines, that agency should then work to clarify the roles and responsibilities of these various team members and ensure that those team members have adequate training to fulfill their roles. One of the other key questions we were asked to take a look at as part of this evaluation was to determine how often projects complied with the sustainable building guidelines. Unfortunately, we found a number of significant issues with program data that prevented us from answering that question. We discuss a number of these issues in greater detail in the report, but I'll highlight two of the key data issues that we found here today. First, it wasn't clear whether all projects that are required to adhere to these guidelines are even tracking their compliance with the guidelines in the first place. We reviewed projects in the 2020 bonding bill to see if they were tracking compliance with the guidelines. And of the more than 100 projects that we determined could be subject to the guidelines, nearly 60 of those 100 projects had not begun tracking their compliance. It's possible that some of those projects aren't actually subject to the guidelines, but there does not appear to be any sort of entity that is actually maintaining a list of which projects are subject to the guidelines in the first place. And so as a result, it's tough for us to say exactly the scope and depth and how prevalent this issue truly is. But nonetheless, it's not possible to assess the extent to which projects are complying with the guidelines if they aren't tracking their compliance in the first place. Additionally, there were significant challenges due to a lack of up-to-date data on projects subject to the guidelines. According to a 2022 report from the Center for Sustainable Building Research, 67% of projects had not submitted up-to-date data during the design and/or construction phases of the project. For projects for which construction was complete, almost all projects had not submitted their data about whether or not they complied with the guidelines in a timely manner. Although these data are necessary to determine whether or not projects are complying with the guidelines, I should note that the legislature hasn't granted any agency authority to require projects to submit data about their compliance, which is another issue we talk about further in the report. So given that statutes currently dictate that the guidelines are required for certain capital construction projects, we think it's important to know whether or not the projects are actually complying with the guidelines. However, it isn't currently possible to determine whether or not that's the case. We recommend that the legislature direct the agency it tasks with administering and overseeing the guidelines to monitor project compliance with the guidelines. The legislature should also amend statutes to ensure that the state can successfully collect the data that it needs in order to determine whether or not projects are in compliance. Once the legislature determines which agency it would like to administer and oversee the guidelines, we also recommend that that agency then ensure that all projects are actually tracking their compliance with the guidelines. So next I want to talk briefly about some program goals. Overall, we think this program would benefit from greater clarity around what the guidelines are actually supposed to achieve. Statutes currently state that the primary objectives of the Sustainable Building Guidelines are to ensure that state buildings and major renovations initially exceed the state energy code as established in Minnesota rules by at least 30%. However, that section of rules referenced in law was repealed in 2009. So in other words, the primary objectives of the Sustainable Building Guidelines in law are obsolete. Additionally, neither the legislature nor any state agency has established measurable goals for the program. As I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, the guidelines currently span 5 different areas of sustainability, from indoor environmental quality to energy in the atmosphere and more. Yet the only measurable goals pertaining to the guidelines are those established for Sustainable Building 2030, which is that energy use and energy consumption and atmosphere aspect of the guidelines. There aren't any measurable goals for the other areas, 4 areas of sustainability that are encompassed by the guidelines. So we recommend that the legislature revise statutes to remove the reference to the repealed rules and update the description of the guidelines' primary objectives. In doing so, we recommend that the legislature consider what is it that the legislature wants the guidelines to accomplish, and then make that clear in law. We also recommend that the legislature direct the agency it tasks with overseeing and administering the guidelines to establish measurable goals for the program. It's difficult to measure whether or not the guidelines are meeting their intended purpose without first establishing some performance goals. And so in establishing those goals, the agency should work to ensure the goals better represent the current breadth of the guidelines, as well as ultimately the objectives that the legislature has established for the program. Finally, I'd like to talk about how this program has impacted projects subject to the guidelines. We received several questions about this throughout the course of our evaluation, both about how have the sustainable building guidelines affected the cost of projects, as well as how have they affected the overall sustainability of the buildings. For example, have the guidelines increased the energy efficiency of the project, or did they decrease ultimate water consumption in the building? Unfortunately, the overall effect of the guidelines on both project cost and project sustainability is unknown. Currently, neither the state nor the Center for Sustainable Building Research systematically collects or analyzes data on project costs. And while the program has some data on sort of sustainability metrics, most of these data are based on estimates rather than actual program outcomes. So both staff at the Departments of Administration and Center for Sustainable Building Research commented to us that collecting data on project costs as well as sustainability just has not been a priority. We think that the questions we received about the effects that the guidelines have both on costs and sustainability are reasonable questions to be asking. However, as I said, unfortunately, right now, the answer to those questions is unknown, and it's not possible to systematically measure those effects. So we recommend that the legislature direct the agency that it tasks with administering and overseeing the guidelines to systematically evaluate the effects of those guidelines on the various building costs and the ultimate building sustainability. Before I conclude, I'll note that, as members may have seen, we released this evaluation in 2023. In your packets, you can find a handout from our office with a recent update on actions that have been taken since we released this report to address each of the various recommendations that we made. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll conclude my formal remarks. I'm happy to stand for questions or step aside for the center to make remarks, whatever you'd prefer.
Thank you, Ms. Badger. Interesting presentation. I know you presented last year in our bonding committee then, and thank you for refreshing us. And we do have some new members on the committee too that are new to the B3 world. So currently, we have these standards. Let's say you have a project that's supposed to meet some of these standards, Ms. Badger, and they do the project, but they just say, you know what, it's a little too costly for me to adhere to the B3, I'm just going to ignore it. So they do their capital project, it's done. Somebody notices from the government, oh, where are your B3 standards? And they're like, well, they were too costly, here's what we did instead. What next?
Madam Chair, thanks for the question. I will first start by noting, so these requirements are requirements by law. Projects are required to follow them if they receive general obligation bond proceeds. That said, from what we found in our evaluation, currently the level of oversight of those projects, if they weren't to follow the guidelines, there would be no consequences at this point. Some of the folks we talked to, both at the Departments of Administration and Commerce, mentioned some potential sort of consequences that they could leverage, for example. So if it's a state project where funds are actually being given to a local government agency on a grant basis, there could potentially be some action taken if the grantee, again, that received these state funds didn't meet the obligations established in their grant paperwork, one of which would be these B3 guidelines, the sustainable building guidelines. But both admin and commerce to this point have not leveraged any sorts of consequences like that. It's more sort of been discussed at a theoretical level.
Great, thank you. Members, do we have any questions? Representative Skraba.
Thank you, Chair. Why do I do this? Sorry. I have a question. Are there any direct disbursements to the agencies to carry out the B3?
Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair, Representative Skraba, good question. Right now, no, is the answer to that question. The Departments of Administration and Commerce combined receive about $1 million, or at least as of the time when we released this report, was receiving about $1 million to then essentially allocate or pay for the contract with the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the U. But in terms of state agencies that maybe are responsible for various capital construction projects, they're not getting specific funding. Neither is Commerce or the Department of Administration to sort of oversee work on the guidelines.
Madam Chair, follow-up?
Representative Scraba.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Ms. Badger, does the U get any funding for the Center for Sustainable Building Research?
Ms. Badger.
Madam Chair, Representative Scraba, yes. So as of the time we released this report, they were getting about $1 million. That is going through this contract that both the Departments of Administration and Commerce have with the center. So it's at least as of 2023, when this came out, it was about $1 million.
Following up,
Representative Scraba.
Madam Chair, Ms. Badger, does that come from general fund agencies or from the U's budget?
Ms. Badger.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, Representative Scraba, it is not from the University of Minnesota's budget. I can get back to you on, I believe it's general fund dollars, but I don't want to speak out of turn, so I can get back to you on that. It definitely is not from the University of Minnesota's budget.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's
Thank
it.
you, Ms. Badger. Thank you, Mr. Representative Scraba. Representative Koznick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Ms. Badger, I'm new to the committee, but a little bit familiar with some of the discussion here from previous committees. But it seems like we have a couple recommendations to assign a responsible agency, another one to establish actual measurable goals, and then finally evaluate the effects of the guidelines on building cost. And I think there was even more recommendations. As I'm kind of looking at it, even before we do figure out what agency might be responsible or what the measurable goals might be, shouldn't we kind of know and evaluate the effects of the cost of these projects? As we have a lot of money, but it's limited. And we have like 6 times the ask for the amount that we're going to do or something like that. So before we implement new guidelines and mandates that drive up the cost, I presume, as from what I'm hearing, shouldn't we evaluate the cost, the building cost effects before we even do anything else? Or can you talk a little bit more about what the implied costs are to a project by following these guidelines and mandates?
Thank you, Representative Koznick. And I think it's more like 8 times. There's about $6 billion worth of asks out there right now, if that's my math is correct. Anyway, Ms. Badger.
Madam Chair and Representative Koznick, so a couple of things. First off, you talked a little bit about sort of what are the general implications on cost of these guidelines. Obviously, we said we don't know the bottom line. I think we've heard from folks the costs can either go up or go down. I think some would argue that the guidelines perhaps increase the initial construction cost, but ultimately in terms of the operation of the building, then the operational costs are lower because maybe they're spending less money on energy, for example, on heating the building. Again, we don't know, sort of plus or minus, how that has shaken out. I think your question about should we first know what the effect on cost is before we do additional work on that, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Certainly the legislature could direct the Department of Administration or Commerce or some other entity, the Center for Sustainable Building Research, for example, to do some analysis on the cost and report that back to the legislature. Obviously, it's one of our recommendations that ultimately it would be helpful to know the outcomes of this program, both in terms of cost and sustainability. Certainly, the legislature could take that step before they direct or address some of these other recommendations. I think the challenge is just at this point, since there's no agency responsible for administering and overseeing the guidelines, those types of activities just aren't happening, so.
Thank you, Ms. Badger.
Follow-up?
Representative Koznick, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that response, and I think should be an inherent incentive for, and I think we're going to hear from other testifiers today on local projects that are kind of the boots on the ground and how it affects them. So I'll be curious to hear what their experience is with these guidelines. But when we talk about operational cost and lowering them or just the upfront building cost, I think there's an inherent motivation to build something that you can sustain operationally and build it in a way that lowers the operational cost anyways. I may question whether the legislature really needs to get involved in that, is one thing. And I had a second thing, Madam Chair, and that is, Ms. Badger, is there a particular agency or a couple agencies, as you recommend, that we should assign a responsible agency for that? Is there a couple different ones that are best suited to take a look at this?
Ms. Badger.
Madam Chair, Representative Kosnick. So right now, as I mentioned, the Departments of Administration and Commerce are responsible for developing the guidelines. I think it makes sense to sort of continue that path and have one of those agencies be responsible for overseeing the guidelines overall. I know in past sessions, there were a number of bills put together that put the Department of Administration ultimately in charge of the guidelines. Commerce is involved in this process, but they kind of hold a more of a niche role, really just focused on the energy component of this, whereas admin overall is looking at the guidelines sort of in a bigger picture. So I think in many ways that makes sense. I think one thing I just would caution the legislature to consider is right now the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the U is playing a pretty significant role. And I think one of the concerns we have is that in establishing whatever entity be in charge, that be some sort of state entity and not a grantee, like the Center for Sustainable Building Research. We think they have a very important role to play as a technical expert and guide, but in terms of deciding whether or not projects have complied with state requirements, making determinations about which projects have to follow these, we think it would be more appropriate to have those responsibilities rest with a state agency so that there's some additional accountability that maybe would be harder to have if those responsibilities were housed within a grantee or a contractee, I should say more specifically.
Thanks, Ms. Badger. Great question. Representative Kosnick. All right. A follow-up at all? Are you done? Okay. Any other members have questions? Oh, Representative Sexton. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. So my background is construction. I'm curious if leadership in environmental design, LEAD, was brought up when we were discussing about this. And really what that is, it's already an established standard. So this is almost a standard on top of a standard. What can be done when you design a building, not only do you have the plans and you think big piece of paper with lines on them, but there should be a spec book. And you can write the spec book to say, this building must comply with LEED, either gold, silver, platinum, that standard. And I'm trying to figure out why we built this guidelines, which isn't a standard. It's a best practices, but yet we're trying to enforce them. So from my background, I'm having a hard time understanding where we're going a little bit. So I'm just curious to get back to my original question. Was LEED discussed, and should we use that? And maybe I'm extending it too much by getting an opinion there, but certainly the folks over at the U of M understand LEED, and maybe if they brought it up, what their recommendation was.
Thank you, Representative Sexton. Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair and Representative Sexton, that's a great question. I will answer to the extent that I can, and then I think perhaps if you want some more detailed answer, the representative from the Center for Sustainable Building Research may be able to get a little bit more in the weeds for you here today. So yes, LEED is another sustainability sort of program, if you will. The guidelines are a little bit different in a couple of ways. One, LEED kind of offers, I guess, if you will, a buffet of options that you can pick from, as long as you pick enough items from that buffet to get basically certain points, then you're considered LEED, gold, LEED, whatever. The guidelines, on the other hand, it's not a buffet. You must do every single component. So it's set up a little bit differently. My understanding, and again, the Center for Sustainable Buildings can talk a little bit more about this, but my understanding is that the idea behind the sustainable building guidelines in Minnesota is that it's a little bit more tailored to specifically Minnesota concerns, I guess, if you will, whereas LEED obviously is a national program. So there's a few differences there. I know Dr. Graves could talk more about that, but I think that's been some of the discussion around LEED versus the sustainable building guidelines.
All right, thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Oh, yes, Representative Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question was centered around how many individuals did you guys end up interviewing in this entire process?
Ms. Badger.
Madam Chair and Representative Allen, that's a great question. It's been a couple years. I can get back to you on an exact count. We did try and, as we always do in our evaluation, really cast a broad net. So we talked with folks both in local governments and the private individuals who are these project members working on projects. We talked with the various state agencies that have some projects subject to the guidelines. We obviously spoke with the Departments of Administration and Commerce, as well as through the center at the U. And so we did try and cast a pretty wide net, and we also then surveyed folks who had recent experience with the guidelines. That would have been sort of key project team members as well. So I can get back to you with an exact count, but we did try and get a wide variety of opinions on this.
Representative Allen.
I really do appreciate you guys and casting as wide of a net as possible just to try to get as much information as we can on this. So thank you for your work on this.
All right, thank you for testifying today.
Madam Chair, I guess I did have a question before the
Okay, well, that's when you
testifier,
could have
if
raised
that's
your
all right.
hand, Representative
Well,
Koznick. All right.
I tried to send you a message there. I don't mean to make the chair's job more difficult. But just kind of curious, in your evaluation, are there examples of projects that you could share with the committee that this worked well with, and then projects that kind of a disaster?
Thank you, Ms.
Or
Badger.
somewhere in the middle.
Thank you, Representative Koznick. Ms. Badger?
Madam Chair and Representative Koznick, I think one of the challenges in providing that information or examples is just that we don't really know what the outcomes were ultimately. And so to say, this has really worked well or this really didn't work well, certainly we heard from some people who were very supportive of the guidelines, think they're very helpful, really felt like they moved their project to be more sustainable, whereas other folks who had commented, we would do this already, or this was, lots of hoops to jump through. But in terms of ultimate outcomes, again, we just don't know, unfortunately. They're not tracking the data for us to determine sort of what was a disaster and where did it work well.
Representative Koznick?
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate that response. I think it's important for the committee to know. We don't know what the effects of putting these mandates on our local units of government or people that are doing building, but it kind of seems like it's just kind of, we did this, now we feel good about ourselves about it, but we don't know if there's actual measurable results necessarily, and I think we should proceed cautiously or maybe even get rid of this.
Representative Koznick, your second statement, speaking my language. Ms. Badger, which this kind of brought up to mind, when you were talking about for some people, it was helpful, other areas it was not helpful. Is there geographic discrepancies between projects where they're located, where it's helpful, where it's not helpful?
Madam Chair, that's a great question. We did not sort of, again, break down by geographic region. I think more what we heard, and I know the center has taken some steps to try and address this challenge, is that the challenge is almost more depending on the size of the project. So if it's like a very small building project, sometimes that can make it a little bit more challenging to sort of encompass this full scope of guidelines versus, a huge, maybe they're doing a major renovation of the correctional facility, for example. It might be a little bit easier to address some of these guidelines in that. I'll note that the Center for Sustainable Building Research has tried to address some of those concerns from folks about building size by having sort of a separate path, if you will, that smaller projects can take in order to be compliant with the guidelines. So I'd say that's more what we heard than specifically geography, was sort of the size or scope of the project and how that then ultimately played into how easy it was or sort of how onerous to implement the guidelines.
Sorry, thanks, Ms. Badger. Does anybody else have any questions? All right, seeing no questions, thank you for your time, Ms. Badger, and Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for your time. And next, we are going to have, the Director for the Center for Sustainable Building Research up, Mr. Richard Graves. Thank you so much, and he's going to give details to the B3 program projects across the board. And then members, you can ask questions on project process and requirements to Mr. Graves, because this is the man who is behind the curtain.
Or the column.
All right, and then Mr. Graves, if you, when you are ready, of course, if you'd identify yourself for the record and tell who you represent, that would be amazing.
Well, I can get started, and maybe the presentation will show up or not.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Richard Graves. I'm the Director of the Center for Sustainable Building Research at the University of Minnesota, and I'm also a professor in the architecture school there. As you just heard, the center is contracted by the Departments of Administration and Commerce to develop and maintain the B3 guidelines and support and review projects. And for the most part, we agree with most of the recommendations in the Office of the Legislative Auditor's report in the program analysis. The only things that I will add is that we do track the number of projects and project performance for the projects that work with us. And, as the report said, that's a subset of the total amount of projects in a bonding bill. But we do track as best we can those projects that do engage with us and do give us their data. To date, in the 23-year history of the program, more than 5,000 people have worked on B3 projects, and there's more than 520 projects kind of in our database that we've tracked requirements and what they've shared with us. For the projects that we do track, we're showing, which again is not all projects, but for the projects that we do track, we're showing that there's almost $17 million of energy savings per year. So that gives us some sense of the operating savings for some projects. But again, by addressing some of the recommendations in the legislative auditor report, and if we could cast a wider net, we would know more of the impact on operating costs and first costs. There's a wide variety of, it's also important to note, there's a wide variety of projects that come through the B3 program from many different funding streams. There are projects that are for state agencies like the Senate office building or the state office building, or projects at the University of Minnesota. But there's also projects for local units of government and other funding streams. So it's a wide variety of sizes of buildings, building types, new buildings, renovations, et cetera, et cetera. In our, and maybe I'll just go from, I think you have this handout, which is our response to the legislative auditor's report. You can just forget about it. I'll just go off this. If you go to our report that was in October of 2023, on page 12, you have an example of one of our scorecards from a project. And so this shows an example of, for projects that do give us their data, we have a system where we can track the energy performance and some measurable metrics. But that's, again, just some of the projects. They have to be working with us, giving us their information. We have a system that we can track. You'll also, within that system, there is the ability to track costs. But over the 11 years that I've been at the center, we've made multiple attempts to track the cost implications on projects. And we get basically cost per square foot by project. And what we really need is cost by systems that are added to the building, upgrades in mechanical systems, upgrades in components, so that we really can get down to the detail level to say, when we're asking for this requirement to meet a performance metric, here are the first costs for capital construction impacts. Are there additional soft costs for engineers, architects to design those things? And then how do those costs translate into operational savings? That's really the kind of cost study that we should be doing for the program. So maybe I'll just summarize, from the report that we made, we really, so this report was based upon doing stakeholder meetings with a wide variety of people involved in the program, from owners to design teams, different project type sizes, from agency projects. We even did specific Greater Minnesota outreach for projects that might have smaller design teams, smaller scope. So in this report, where we outlined recommendations we'd like to see in a bill to address a lot of these challenges, they really kind of fell into 6 categories. Updating the goals and measuring performance. We agree that we should really clarify in statute exactly what the goals should be and have measurable ways to track those goals so that we can report back on these projects that come through bonding bills. How did it do? Where were there barriers? Where were there challenges, so that updates can be made in the future? We also agree that there's a lot of clarifications that need to happen for the applicability of projects. There's multiple different pathways, whether projects are renovations or new or different sizes, if they have to have pre-designs or not. And there's lots of confusion with project teams on knowing whether the guidelines apply to them or not. So that would streamlining the definition of what projects need to comply would go a long way to straightening those things out. In addition, in that section, we think there's a lot of room for improvement of pre-design submissions. When projects know they are going to submit for bonding, clarifying what they need to do, what should the scope be in the project. That's a place where we can see where are the additional costs. We can clarify and work with project teams to make sure they've covered things, so that when it comes to the bonding bill, you know that the projects in the bonding bill are, reflect the requirements. We also, in applicability, think that the legislature consider a project minimum size. And so the projects below a certain size, maybe it's 20,000 square feet, which is our small project guideline. Those projects don't need to comply with the guideline, because there's a lot of those projects, and the small projects in particular have a lot of challenges with cost requirements. They often don't have design teams with a lot of disciplines that need to deal with some of these requirements. So we think a project minimum size is a really good idea.
Mr. Graves?
Yeah.
Could you, just for the body, I'm curious to know, because you said that you're funded through a grant
So, yes. we're
from us.
Funded, and I would have to get back to you on the exact route of all of the funding, but funded, the $1 million goes to, and it's two $500,000 amounts go to the Department of Administration and Department of Commerce that then goes through to us to run the program. We then contract with subcontractors who work with us, that some groups do reviews for us. There's another group that tracks the B3 benchmarking database where projects can track their energy performance and those kinds of things. So I'd have to get back to you on the exact funding stream, or that's a question for Administration and Commerce.
Right, and that wasn't my question. You cut me off before I was able to finish my question, so. But at any rate, the actual question is, when did this relationship start?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The relationship with the center, I'd have to go back to get the exact year because it predates when I joined the center 11 years ago. But I believe it was about 22 years ago when the program first was created in statute. The center was hired to develop the guidelines.
Great, thank you. And I just want to give you a heads up. There's many questions that are going to be directed to you that should be directed to the Department of Admin, but they were asked to come to testify and they refused for some reason. So if it's a question that's not related to you, go ahead and let us know that it's an admin question. And then I'll let you continue. Oh, no, one more question here. So you're talking about the $17 million in savings for projects.
Right.
Now, on those savings, how many years does it take for a return on investment? If the project is being raised in costs on this end, how long are they seeing, how long until they break even with those energy savings, so to speak?
Yeah, and Madam Chair, good question. In the energy section of the guidelines, SB 2030, statute says that we need to analyze additional costs with return on investment based upon the way utilities calculate return on investment. What that means in plain terms, we translate that into a 12-year payback for measures historically. That's how we translated that into if you have to pay more for, say, a mechanical system, that needs to pay back in 12 years for it to be a viable option. Otherwise, you don't have to do it. In the latest version of SB 2030 that was released January 1st, which is the auditor showed how the energy program steps down and gets more aggressive every 5 years. In the 90% better program that went live as of January 1st this year, those payback calculations were changed to be the items needed to pay back within the life of an item, so that there's a range of different paybacks that vary between 6 years and I think as high as 20 years, but I could get the committee that updated list, so.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll let you continue on.
Okay.
Thanks.
In addition to our recommendations, we also feel in Section 3 that there should be there should be a process for tracking. Once an agency is determined to be responsible for tracking the guidelines, which we think in the auditor report is one of the key recommendations, because without our experience in working with project teams, we're a center at the university. If we ask for something, there's no stick that we have, so they can just ignore us, not give us the information. But if there's someone who can kind of track projects and request the data, that would be a huge improvement. And part of that, the improvements that would come from that, is that we can track compliance. But another important thing is to create a waiver process where, working with project teams, you can see that for that particular project on a particular site with exactly what they're trying to do, there may be some of the guidelines that we should be waiving because it doesn't apply to the site, or a variety of reasons that could be developed with the legislature to adjust project requirements to specific conditions. In addition, in Section 4, there's a lot of needs for outreach and training for the program that we think should happen. In particular, we find that owners of bonded projects need training on what their responsibilities are, what the requirements are, how to work with design teams and project teams on the B3 requirements. And then finally, in the final two areas of recommendations, we think that an agency should be assigned, that it should not be the Center for Sustainable Building Research in charge of administering and overseeing the guidelines. I think, an agency should be in charge. That's not us. We should be advising and helping and giving technical assistance. And we think that is our valuable role going forward. And then whatever decisions are made around creating new goals, new requirements, whatever, finding a system that aligns support for and review of projects with those goals and that scope should be developed so that we have the right amount of support for working with the project teams, giving them the support they need, and tracking compliance. So, Madam Chair, with that, I'll close and I can answer what are probably a lot of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Do we have any member questions? Representative Allen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just kind of diving back into some of the things you discussed. You were talking about a savings of energy of, what was it,
17 million.
17 million. So am I to understand that's a rough estimate? There's no real hard numbers?
That's,
Mr. Graves?
Madam Chair, Member Allen, so I could follow up with the committee that we give a report to the agencies quarterly on which projects we're tracking savings on, and therefore what that $17 million number reflects.
Representative Allen?
Madam Chair, follow-up question. The other thing you kind of touched into a little bit is you were talking about groups that were doing some contract work for you in terms of building or some of the building projects that are currently going on. Are they independent, what kind of independent contractors are they? Are they nonprofits? Are they, what are they exactly? If you could clarify that. And thank you.
Mr. Graves?
Madam Chair, Member Allen, so the core members of the B3 team are the center that does project management, oversights the guidelines. Then there's a for-profit company, Willdan, that manages, they do energy modeling and manage databases that track energy performance. So they are responsible for the energy benchmarking database. They also built the project tracking tool for us. So they manage that tracking tool and if there are any updates there. The Center for Energy and Environment, which is a nonprofit, they do reviews of the energy portion of projects. So they do project reviews of compliance for the energy portion of the guidelines. And then LHB is an architecture and engineering firm, private company that is on the team that does sort of testing of cost effectiveness of guidelines, applicability or impact if there are guideline determinations that might increase soft costs or engineering costs, architecture costs. They also work with us on the case studies database where we have the scorecard where we track, again, the projects that submit to us, we track metrics there, so.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Graves. Do we have any other member questions? Okay. Representative Sexton, and then we're going to move on to public testimony. And Mr. Graves, you'll stick around for after public testimony in case there's some questions afterwards, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'll try and make my questions brief, ma'am, but I do want to talk to you afterwards. Can you want to take a stab at the lead question?
Yeah.
While we have a separate standard?
Madam Chair, Member
Mr. Graves?
Sexton, so the lead rating system is an international rating system.
Absolutely.
The B3 guidelines actually predate LEED, so LEED looked at the B3 rating system when it was being created of what does a green building rating system look like. Why not lead? So I think that the easiest answer for that is, lead applies to a lot of different projects. So
We've got a lot of things.
that would be a bit of a challenge for state-funded projects with ranges of sizes. They'd actually use multiple different lead rating systems. And then again, this is my opinion, but probably worth further discussion. The state would want to know what their goals are for the bonded projects. And then I think the analogy was that it's sort of like a salad bar or buffet, that once we want certain, we want energy efficiency and some other things out of a program like that, you would want to create kind of an overlay that maybe you'll use LEAD, but we want you to do these points within LEAD. And then I think the other factor is the cost of a program like that in terms of soft costs, again, potential capital cost increases and things like that would be a thing to analyze, versus the B3 program. In our set of recommendations, one of the challenges that we see is that we historically have tried to align with LEAD, and that has created some of our challenges where we have almost 90 requirements. I feel we could reduce our number of requirements, probably cutting in half the number of requirements, streamlining to a new set of goals developed by the legislature, and it actually could create a more cost-effective and streamlined system that met the legislature's goals. But it certainly is something we could look at both ways and what were the pros and cons. So,
Thank you. Ma'am,
Yes, Representative Sexton.
Page 12, on your scorecard, if we want to look at that. As I talked about with the spec book, normally you'd write a specification, we want to meet a certain standard for your energy, carbon, everything else. And then we would go back at the end of the project and confirm that we met those standards for that particular project as opposed to in general. Are there other scorecards that do something like that?
Mr. Graves?
Madam Chair, Member Sexton, there are a number of energy scorecards that exist for projects. The thing I would add is the statute actually requires project teams to submit this design level and then for us to track actual performance for 10 years. But that's part of our challenge where project teams don't come back and give us the actuals to compare to these targets, which would be really helpful to know the things we're putting in projects are really performing, or they're things that it's a technology that's estimated to perform, but it's not really for a variety of reasons. Could be the technology, could be the installation, and we would know that and be able to adjust requirements. So again, I'm happy to follow up with the members and have meetings to get into as much detail as you want in this process. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. That was my exact observation as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Representative Sexton. Does anybody else have any further questions? Okay, Representative Scrub, and then we're going to go straight to public testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Graves, Representative Sexton did this for a living. The contractors, all I'm seeing is these disconnects, and I apologize. I'm trying to gather my thoughts here because they're so disconnected. 2030 energy carbon reduction. Keep hearing it. Commerce does it. Commerce does it. The U is working on it. But we still need B3. But we have LEAD. So what are we doing? I mean, I'm running around in my head right now. I'm just like, I don't get it because the contractor's on the job that shows up says, what do we got to do? This is what we have to do. And now I'm hearing, well, that's what you have to do for LEAD, but Minnesota bonding money needs you to do this. What do most projects in Minnesota bonding money do? They match with federal money. The federal says, you got to do LEAD. So I'm sitting here trying to figure out, there's something here that I can't put my finger on, but it just doesn't feel right what we're doing here. It seems like and as a contractor, more and more and more, it just keeps piling up to the point where it's like, let's just not do that. Let's do whoever's going to be managing us, i.e. LEAD, let's do that. And then you guys are out running around trying to say, well, we should be doing this. And the Office of Legislative, OLA, comes in and says, hey, this thing's all messed up. We need to fix this. So I'm willing to work with anyone to fix this. It just seems there's so much redundancy here that, and again, we can talk after and maybe calm me down a little bit and make me figure out what's going on, but it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm trying to put this all to make it make sense, and I don't get it. I don't understand why we're doing this since 2011, and it's 2025, and there's nothing here. Well, we're not sure if it's working. Okay. Why are we doing lead then? You know, so anyway, I'm not confused. I just need to be straightened out in the direction that we're trying to go here. More of a statement than a question. Sorry, Mr. Graves. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Representative Scraba, for those words of wisdom this morning. Mr. Graves, thank you for testifying in front of us, and if members have questions after the committee, Mr. Graves will be around for you. But next, we are going to have the City of Alexandria come up. We have City of Alexandria, for anybody who does not know, is a city that is easy to get to but hard to leave. And we have two of my favorites here. We have Bill Franzine, who sits on the Runestone Community Center Commission, as well as a city council member. And it's Franzine. Sometimes I'm asked if you're related to Bill. I'm like, nope, different. Zen, mine's son. So anyway, and then we have Mr. Martin Schultz, which I call him as Marty because he's my friend. So if you two want to present on the bonding project that was awarded to you a number of years ago and what you're seeing there. Thank you. Oh, state your name for the record, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, for allowing us to be here today. My name is Marty Schultz. I'm Martin Schultz. I'm the city administrator for the City of Alexandria, and I've been in that role for 10 years. I've been with the city for 20 years. I've heard some discussion today about kind of hearing some local boots on the ground information on how these standards are working, and hopefully we can provide a local perspective. What we want to do today is just kind of tell our story, and it's been very informative for me to hear the first two testifiers today, but I'll give you a little background on our project. City of Alexandria owns and operates the Runestone Community Center. I would imagine probably in all of your districts you've got a city that runs a community center. Our community center opened in 1978. It's a multi-purpose facility. We use it for dry floor events. We use it for ice events. At any time during the year, you might find a home and garden show, hockey, figure skating, curling, and what really makes me nervous is when we pour sand and dirt in and have a rodeo in the summertime. But it's been that way since 1978. We use it for a lot of different things. Just a brief history on the project. We've talked about the need. Right now we have 2 floor areas that we use for multi-purpose. We've been talking for 15 years about the need for a 3rd floor area because of the demand for all types of uses in Alexandria. City did some feasibility studies in the mid-2010s and eventually began to make requests for bonding funding, I think first in 2016, then 2018, and then 2020. We were successful in the October 2020 bonding bill. The legislature authorized $5.6 million for our project. At that time, we had our goal was we'd have half the dollars from the state, hopefully, and then the other dollars would come from a combination of city sources and a fundraising capital campaign that was going on in the community. Interesting note, in 1978, when the project was built for $975,000, it seems quaint now to think about that. Half of it came from the community, half came from the city. So we've kind of tried to replicate that with this project. Of course, when we made that funding request that was initially submitted into the capital budget system in April of 2019, when we thought we had maybe a $13 or $14 million project, bonding was approved in October of 2020. We started detailed design work in the spring of 2021. Of course, a lot of things happened in those intervening 2 years, as we all know, with construction costs and inflation. When we got our initial full cost estimates in the fall of 2021, yes, we had inflation costs that happened during the pandemic, but was, I would say, surprising to us. Our project is an expansion and a renovation. And initially, we were trying to do it all together at one time. We looked at approximately $3 million in increased costs in order to meet the B3 guidelines and standards with the project. We kind of stepped back when we saw that initial cost number. Council decided to kind of turn the capital campaign committee loose and try to raise money in the community as much as possible as we evaluated how we would try to meet these standards. So that fundraising was going on in 2022, early 2023. Ultimately, we made the decision in June of 2023 to divide this project into two pieces. The council simply could not wait any longer to begin construction and wait for construction inflation costs to increase. So we elected to do an expansion or a renovation of the existing spaces and some support space and lobby expansion, and do that and kind of make that the city share of the project. We essentially front-loaded the city contribution to the project to do that work, not use the bonding dollars, therefore not have to do the B3 requirements, and try to, hopefully the goal was, complete that work, which is under construction right now. If you have kids or you've been to Alexandria this winter for any kind of competition, sorry for the mess, but we're keeping the thing running while the project is going on. So we have still, though, as that project's been going on, trying to figure out a way to make the new arena, the new floor, which is the second part of the project, happen. Our idea was by basically turning that into as simple as possible, a rectangle of new construction, I think 35 to 40,000 square feet, no significant renovation. We'd hope to try to simplify these B3 requirements, make them a little easier to manage. What's happening, though, included in a sheet that I sent to the committee administrator, our most recent cost estimate in August of 2024, we're at 40% design development, 40% of the way through design for phase 3, is we are still looking at, in August of 2024 dollars, about $2.7 million in costs directly attributable from our design team to meeting the B3 guidelines. And I'll just highlight them briefly. There's 3 of them that are in particular. There's, we have a photovoltaic solar panel system at $1.52 million. We have a geothermal HVAC system that we would install at about $1.1 million. And then with the way the guidelines are written, and I am not an architect or an engineer, so I'm not an expert on trying to meet these, but our team, as mentioned by the testifiers, have been working with the folks at the University of Minnesota to try to understand these guidelines and work through them over the last few years. But our understanding is natural gas as a form of heating for the building does not work well. So we're looking at having to do electricity in the arena, which requires us to have 2,000 amp service in order to provide that. And that's about $100,000. So how do we proceed? What have we been talking about with the council in order to make this happen? The challenges we have is that right now, the earliest we could proceed with construction in phase 3 is probably the spring of 2026. So the reality is the $2.7 million in August of 2024 costs will be $3 million or more to meet the B3 standards in 2026, if we're even able to proceed. But the challenge we face is that at a $17 to $21 million project, there simply isn't enough in city sources, private funds, and the $5.6 million in bonding to make that affordable for taxpayers. So one of the alternatives that we're looking at to make the project happen is looking at potentially a sales tax, local sales tax vote in November of 2026. That would push construction out to, at best, spring of 2027, and more cost increases there. The other, fortunately, the legislature last year approved an extension of our October 2020 approved bonding dollars to December of 2028. So we have a little time to figure out how to use these $5.6 million most efficiently. Other uncertainties that we've wrestled with, soft costs and design and maintenance of geothermal and solar systems. We don't have any geothermal and solar systems that we currently operate, so we don't have experience with those systems. Will we need to have someone hired to provide maintenance, ongoing kind of work, commissioning? There's unknown payback. And then one of the challenges that we have, one of the suggestions that we make at the end of my testimony is this type of building, where it's used for dry floor events, but also for ice uses, has a very unique energy load. And many of our designers, I asked yesterday when we met with our designers, do you know of any arenas that have ice sheets in them that have geothermal and solar? The answer that they had was no. I can't say that there there isn't any for sure, but I'm not aware of any. I go to a lot of arenas because my kids are involved in these kind of things, and I've never seen one with panels on the roof, or there may be one or two that have geothermal, but none that have both, to our designers' awareness. So we don't really want to be the test case to install both of those things, quite frankly. So what are some potential solutions as we've kind of talked about this? And quite frankly, over the years, we've talked about, do we do this building and just not use the bonding dollars? We've really hesitated with that because we spend a lot of time coming to you all and explaining the need for this. Probably isn't going to be very popular to hand the money back. And so how do we do this and do it where we make sense? Well, we can come in and ask for additional bonding dollars. And we talked about that last year, asked for 7.2 additional dollars, 7.2 million. But the challenge with that, looking past our project, is if every project comes in and asks for additional dollars, I think it was mentioned by one of the representatives earlier, the pot is only so big, and there's just going to be less projects that happen statewide. You know, the B3 standards, and I am not an expert, and I appreciated learning what I've learned today, but we've wondered if there's been some unintended consequences since these were passed in 2010. And kind of a double whammy of not only the cost of the implementing the B3 standards, but just the general inflation we've seen in construction period has created this circumstance. And I want to read, it's kind of been discussed a little bit during the testimony today, but you know, I asked as we kind of talked with the council and talked with the community about this project and figure out how do you explain this B3 standards to people, you know, and I asked our architects to explain SB 2030, and what they said is, you know, the goal is that by 2030 that we have an up to 100% reduction in carbon emissions for all new buildings, i.e. net zero. This goal, and it was talked about during previous testimony, that it's been ramped up 10% every 5 years since 2010. So our project that started in 2020 was at the 80% threshold, and now, as was mentioned previously, we're at 90% for 2025. What our design team said is, prior to 2020, when the standard went to 80%, they could get there for B3 with more traditional, what we would call construction methods, high efficiency HVAC system, building materials. What they have found, once they got to 80%, it is very difficult to do that without going to geothermal or solar kinds of systems. And so what I wonder is if we have kind of a coming storm of projects that either are unbuilt yet from 2020 dollars or will be in this year's bonding bill that are going to struggle with these standards. You know, other things that we would ask is, and I think it was maybe even mentioned previously, is some consideration for the unique nature of projects. This is certainly not one size fits all. We have a unique facility. We've also asked in the past about renewable energy credits and meeting the standards by doing off-site solar. Now, it's my understanding that there's kind of a matrix of you need to kind of go through all these options before you could get to renewable energy credits or off-site solar. We'd like to see maybe those be considered a little bit at the onset. I have a couple of interesting facts that were provided to me by our municipal utility that I want to pass on regarding, first, in Alexandria, we have a municipal utility. We buy our wholesale power from Missouri River Energy Services, and they do a fantastic job of finding affordable electricity, but also trying to meet the state's renewable energy goals. In 2025, Alexandria's power mix will be 33% renewable, 54% carbon-free. So already meeting the 2030 standards, and hopefully on the way to where we're supposed to be in 2040. But I also want to mention the renewable energy credits. Our general manager of our utility indicated to me that if we wanted to buy credits for renewable energy to get to what would be a 100% renewable building, the cost to the city for that would be $900 a year versus what we have in our project right now of $2.7 million. Now, I'm certain I'm probably simplifying that, and I also believe that you cannot use renewable energy credits to completely meet the goals of B3. But those are some examples and some information that we think is important for the legislature to have. In closing, I mean, obviously, anyone who runs a building like the city of Alexandria does, we don't want to have a building that's an energy hog. We want to build it as efficiently as possible. but we also want to build it affordably. And it's very difficult to try to work with our council, and Councilmember Franzine is on our commission, and we've wrestled with these standards and being unsure of whether the payback will be there, unsure of the total operating costs. Many of these things you can't really fully understand until you do all of your design work on a geothermal system. Well, that's a more upfront investment by the city in these projects. So, you know, these goals are noble, but we hope by telling our story that there's some opportunity to look at the B3 guidelines and find some ways to make them make sense for individual projects. So bonding dollars can be used, scarce bonding dollars can be used as affordably as possible and spread around to as many projects as possible in the state. Madam Chair, members, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz there. I appreciate, because we've been in contact many times about that, and I always joked that the Runestone Community Center was the bane of my existence for a while, and when it was Paul Anderson's building, I had the parking lot and he had the actual community center, so I forced him to be the #1 carrier of the Runestone Community Center bonding bill. So those are good times. Now I have both the parking lot and the entire building, so yay me. Does anybody have any questions for the members from the City of Alexandria before we move on? All right, seeing none, thank you so much for your time. Mr. Franzine, did you want to add anything at all?
Madam Chair, no, thank you.
No? Okay, great.
For inviting us, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for making the drive down, and I guess we'll see you back in Alec, huh? Okay. In between here, we do have on our official agenda, we do have Lake of the Woods, but we're going to quickly go to Mr. Jeremy Estenson, who has a quick blurb about a situation he ran into regarding a bonding project. Would you please state your name for the record?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jeremy Estenson with Taft Advisors, and I would be remiss if I didn't say I'm a native of Alexandria, and my daughter and I are going to be up there visiting Grandma later on tonight. I represent a subset of the critical access dental clinics in greater Minnesota. A number of years ago, 4 or 5, I don't remember exactly, we sought bonding dollars to build in addition to a Pipestone Community Health building in a deal done in conjunction with the Pipestone Council where these dental services were critically needed. We were awarded $500,000, which was sufficient to build the building. And I'll admit that neither the clinic that I work for or I were an expert in this area. And we, accepting the blame, we only later found out those costs would be imposed on us, and those requirements would be imposed on us. I'm not an expert on whether or not these requirements are for the better, for the worse, the ROI, but what I can tell you I think is an important data point. That project didn't happen. And the $500,000 were ultimately turned back, to Mr. Schultz's point. The project eventually, 3 or 4 years later, did happen, but without the help of the state. And we view this as something that clearly is not unique to us. At that time, we were commiserating with Senators Howe and a number of others from northern Minnesota that were experiencing the same sort of problem. So again, Madam Chair, thank you for just a minute to describe this problem, but I think it's something important for the committee to consider.
Mr. Estenson, for the record, how much did the cost go up on that project?
The costs, we were awarded $500,000. Our building design team estimated the B3 compliance costs at $250,000 for a total of a 50% increase.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, thanks for your time, and maybe we'll see you in Alexandria this weekend.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members.
Thank you. Oh, can you hold your question and ask offline, because we are tight for time? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, so next we will have Representative Duran, if you want to come up and introduce your constituents for the record and talk a little bit about the situation in your district. And then for the record, just to let you know, since you are a freshman, next time you do present in front of a committee, you should have treats for us, okay? All right, thank you. All right, go ahead and state your name for the record and proceed with your introduction, Representative.
Madam Chair, committee, thank you guys for having me today. My name is Bedell Duran. I represent District 2A, which is most of Beltrami County, northern part of Clearwater County, and all of Lake of the Woods County. So today we're here to talk to you with Commissioner Arneson. Today we're here to talk to you about some concerns we have about the B3. And right now what we have Lake of the Woods in desperate need of a new jail, and we're looking at bonding dollars for that. Now, with that being said, with all the regulations and everything that's coming with the B3 issue, it's drastically impacting what we can do for Lake of the Woods and for the people up there. So I'm here to say that this is a priority of mine, and I'm here to ask that we listen to the people and stop with these ridiculous mandates that the state of Minnesota is coming down on us, making it harder for people to expand on what they need for the state of Minnesota. So with that being said, I'm here to introduce Commissioner Arneson, and he will let you guys know a little bit more about the project.
Great, thank you, Representative Duran. Mr. Arneson, welcome to the Capital and Investment Committee. We are thrilled that you made the drive from Lake of the Woods. That's quite a distance there. I hope you flew and not drove. But at any rate, if you want to state your name for the record and continue on with your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I'm Edward Arneson, Commissioner of Lake of the Woods County. This is the beginning of my 25th year as commissioner, so I have some perspective on local government, and like my representative said, that we are looking for assistance, bonding assistance on our facility. Just to give you some geographic background, Lake of the Woods County is right next to Canada. We border, we're the northernly most point in the continental United States. Lake of the Woods is our biggest natural asset. Lake of the Woods is 1 million acres of water. Our side is about 330,000 acres, and it's a great recreational asset for the state. But we have a low population. Our population is 3,763 people. I think we're the second smallest. Our median income is $55,000, and that's household income is $55,000. We rank 80th amongst 87 counties. But with that, we have also a high influx of we have a large tourist population. There's at times with our population of 3,700, there'll be days that we'll have 5,000 to 6,000 people, especially this time of the year, fishing on Lake of the Woods that we're responsible for. Lake of the Woods County is responsible for the people that are recreating on Lake of the Woods. The Department of Corrections, and we're speaking a lot on mandates now, they've degraded our facility down to a 72-hour facility, so that's all the longer we can hold inmates. We have about 7 police officers on the force. Typically 2 are on duty at a time, but with that mandate, we're forced to transport our prisoners and inmates to 3 different counties at this time. We have inmates in Pennington, Cooch, and I believe Aiken County. And we're limited because no county has to take them. It has to be an agreeable situation with both counties. So if we have a prisoner of special needs, psychological issues, special medical needs, it makes it very difficult for us to process those individuals. We estimate per year we're spending about 100,000 just in transportation. And the trouble with that, there's an opportunity cost too. We're driving somebody out of county where we can't be patrolling. And we're like a lot of other counties, we're short of law enforcement staff. So those extra staff hours, we have to man with overtime. So our overtime budget is increasing. So these things just, they keep snowballing. And the cost just, and it's so hard to control these costs for our local governments. The reason with our small tax base, our tax levy is about $3.4 million per year. With this mandate, so we have the DOC, Department of Corrections mandate. And the reason, and I don't disagree with our facility was built in like 1980. It's getting old, needs upgrades. We just spent $150,000 fixing the sewer. The air conditioning is bad, the roof is bad, the windows are old. The bathrooms are not compliant to the new ADA standards. So we looked at remodeling it, and that didn't make any sense. So we want a new facility for the future that's going to serve the public, not just Lake of the Woods County, but we think the whole state for the next 30 years. But if we do this out of our back pocket, out of levy dollars, our estimate is within the county, it will raise the levy 30% alone for the next 20 years or however long our bonding money would suffice, but that is our estimate. We're looking at a facility of about 10 beds. It's modest, we've scaled it back. We were looking at a 24-bed facility, but with the costs were so astronomical on that. And our last estimates were before COVID. So we got the mandate from DOC that we had to update the facility or remain 72 hour. Then COVID hit. And so we were here last session looking for bonding, and the House allocated $5 million, but as we all know, that didn't go anyplace. So I guess we're back, and something that new came up that we weren't aware of was this SB, is it 3? That looks like it could increase our costs by $2 million. We're looking at our total project cost of $10 million, where we have $2 million saved, and we'll look for other sources at $2 million, and we're hoping to receive $6 million from the state with that. But all of a sudden, our architect said this SB 3 could cost us an additional $2 million. Well, I mean, if we have to put that on the local end, that almost doubles or adds 50% of the project cost on the local levy. And now we're also looking at a MPCA requirement that we have to abandon our demo landfill, and that's gonna cost us $600,000. So you put all these mandates together, and it's getting hard to manage these little counties. It's just, I've been there 25 years. I've done 25 different budgets and levies, and the last 10 years, our goal is to keep our levy to 2 to 3%.
Yeah.
Growth at about 1%.
So, Mr. Arneson,
Things
Mr.
are just blowing out of proportion.
Right. So, Mr. Arneson, when we had spoken offline, your project, you're now redoing the project to escape the B3 requirements, correct? Could you just tell us a little bit about what that means to your county?
That was our indication that we heard from our architects, that if we were under 10,000, but I'm learning today that if it's a new project, that's for renovation. So maybe within the different layers that we were misinformed or didn't know all of the information, but all of a sudden, this is new to us today, that we would be required under the SB3 to do this because it's a new project. We're not
Representative Duran.
renovating an old jail, we're building a new one.
Yes, and thank you, Madam Chair. And to go what Commissioner Arneson was saying is that there was a drastic change into the actual model of the jail just because of the B3 regulations that would be implemented. So they actually decreased it from a $60 million project to a $6 million project is what they're requesting now. So just because of the mandates and everything that was going on with this B3 regulations here, it drastically changed what they can do or what they believe that they can do for the county and a necessary need that they have up there as well, so.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, we certainly do have some things to work on, and I look forward to Representative Sexton's ideas on how to drastically improve this program to make it more user-friendly. Probably Representative Scraba has some words of advice there too. No? Okay. Yeah, okay. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Arneson or Representative Duran before we leave? No? Okay. Well, I want to thank you too for testifying and giving us your feedback on the sustainable building guidelines. And Mr. Arneson, we do hope that the legislature can put together a bonding bill that reflects the priorities of Lake of the Woods, okay?
Thank you very much.
And with that, thank you so much for appearing before the committee today, and for everybody that participated, thank you. And so if there is no other public testimony, do we have any other more public testimony here today? All right, no more public testimony. All right, well, if there is no more business before the committee, then our next committee meeting will be next Tuesday, and that'll be at 10:15, and then we'll have a committee hearing on Thursday. Agenda to be determined. Stay tuned. I'm sure it's going to be super exciting. I know I'm excited to find out what we're going to be talking about on Tuesday. And with that said, the meeting is adjourned.